Welcome to the first event of Local Action Global Impact here at Reeves-Reed Arboretum. Why are we here tonight? Reeves-Reed Arboretum, along with our partners, CL Power, Scott Fisher, and Green Summits, Melissa Spur, where are you, Melissa? And Donna Patel, champion best practices in sustainability to empower individuals to actionable results. We're open to discussing different views in our attempt to build consensus for action. The format will be, I will put some questions to the panel. Some of them are directed to one specific speaker. Some will be directed to the whole panel. Some of the questions are actually being contributed by panelists. So you won't know all of that. Neither will they. But the end result will be, I think, a very interesting discussion about sustainability and climate change and its effect in New Jersey, especially on our water systems. So let's start. We're honored to have such an illustrious panel tonight, so please allow me to introduce them. If you would hold the applause till after I introduced everybody, we'll move faster. First, we have J. Douglas Reid here. He's part of the BASF Corporation's remediation team for over 20 years, where he leads the Corporate Sustainable Remediation Program. He's also worked with the UN on sustainable development of urban environments. Most recently, he has been using the concepts of sustainable development to improve the efficiency of environmental, social, economic recovery of urban river restoration. Jennifer Coffey, Executive Director of the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. Jennifer is a member of the New Jersey State Water Supply Advisory Council and the New Jersey Society of Women Environmental Professionals. Melanie McDermott is a senior researcher at Sustainability Institute of the College of New Jersey. This institute provides the staff for the nonprofit organization Sustainable Jersey. She has over 20 years' experience in research, policy analysis, and consulting related to the social impacts of climate change. Her current research includes the economic vulnerability to climate change on the Jersey Shore and promoting adaptation, resilience, and sustainability in coastal New Jersey. David Naidoo, right here, president of the City of Summit's Common Council and partner with K&L Gates, specializing in environment, land, and natural resources, covering a broad range of areas such as the cleaning up of sites contaminated with hazardous wastes, brownfield redevelopment, eminent domain, natural resource damage, oil spills, and the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. And last but not least, our wonderful guest panelist, Governor Christine Todd Whitman, president of the Whitman Strategy Group, was EPA administrator from 2001 to 2003, and former governor of New Jersey from 1994 to 2001. Please welcome our panelists. So Earth's climate is changing. Our planet's surface temperature, atmosphere, and ocean chemistry, precipitation, and drought patterns, and sea levels have all seen significant changes from only a century ago. So this question is to all the panelists. What is climate change? Is it different from global warming?
Okay, I'll start with that. Climate change is what's going on, and it's caused by global warming. I mean, that's the difference. Warming is what's causing the climate to change. And what we're seeing is, particularly, I mean, the Arctic, we've got a perfect example because the Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And we see what the real impact is on people's lives, on their livelihoods. There are a number of villages, there are about 4 now that are currently have agreed to move of Native Alaskans. And they're moving them inland, but the question is, who pays for it? Where do they go? What do you move? Do you move the hospital first or the grocery store first and then the houses? How do you do this? And it is enormously expensive and enormously important. But the thing that people have to understand, because we got off to this discussion of it's all global warming, which from a scientific point of view is the correct response, But that gave people like Jim Inhofe the ability to take a snowball onto the floor of the Senate when it should have been warm temperature and throw it at somebody and say, tell me about this global warming. And that's where you also get into the difference, which people don't understand, between climate change and weather. Climate and weather, and there is a difference.
Anyone else want to chime in on this?
I would just say ditto to exactly what Governor said.
That's a sneaky answer.
I would agree with everything that she said, and just add that the question had mentioned over the previous 100 years we're seeing change, and it really is a rapid and accelerating change in the last 50 years. And the projections that we're seeing for increased flooding and increased drought, because we have two ends of the same problem with water, are only projected to get worse as the climate continues to get warmer. And the unfortunate issue that we're seeing with people who live in Alaska, and do you move the school first? Do you move the residents first? Do you move the grocery store? Do you move the hospital? As a coastal state, New Jersey is going to be forced to deal with those same exact issues, and many communities on our coasts and in our bay areas are being forced to answer those questions right now as well.
Anyone else want to add?
I was just going to remark that some advocates and suggest that we use the term climate disruption because, you know, the whole thing is being driven by the concentration of carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases leads to all sorts of knock-on effects that cause our climate to behave in new and somewhat unpredictable ways. So that if you use that term climate disruption, then nobody can say, ha, got you. Your model didn't project exactly what we thought, because, you know, there are all these feedback effects that are indeed very alarming that could, you know, suddenly accelerate the rate of change due to things like the peat in the tropical areas and the permafrost melting, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a reminder.
I've almost changed things entirely, and I've stopped when I talk to big groups talking about climate change disruption at all.
Okay.
And I talk about health, because climate change and the minute you put climate in, everybody gets into their corners because they know what's coming, and it's so politicized. But if you say to people, between 200 and 300 people a year in this country die from dirty airborne related causes, and if you ask people, how many of you have asthma, know someone with asthma, particularly when you go into schools and ask the kids, I get 2/3 of the hands go up. And when you say that, while we don't know what causes asthma, we do know what can trigger an attack and what can exacerbate an attack. And if you don't want emphysema, if you don't want heart disease, if you don't want these allergies to get to a point where you can't function, then we ought to try to clean the air. And it just so happens that carbon is a big part of the problem. And if you address it that way, you start to get at the climate change drivers, but you don't do it trying to wend your way through this highly politicized terminology.
I think it's, go ahead. I think it's also, this discussion is now morphing into more of the disruption element of what global climate change, and I think the word global is very important in that context, because it isn't simply the fact that you have an environmental impact. You have impact, as we were talking about, health, but also just peoples and where they live and how they move, and migration of peoples and communities, and that has not just simply what happens to individuals, but it has a political impact on different societies. And so some of the disruptions that will happen, undoubtedly, because if you reduce a food supply in one area or change how people can live in an area, you will cause people just by necessity to move to somewhere else, and that has the ability to have friction between different groups of people. And so it's a much larger issue when you start thinking about it as, I mean, we all appreciate how large the issue is, but the tentacles of all of its impacts are great.
That's why it's a national security issue.
Yeah.
Well, it was what drew me to some of the research that Jennifer has done. I'm sorry, that Melanie has done, because I didn't think of the societal impact as much as I thought about health or just water. But it also impacts society because of the various strata that people live in, the economic strata, and where is the work being done, and where's the focus taking place. So it's very interesting. Doug,
You want
go
to
for it.
respond to that before I...
Just to add on or elaborate to say that it is an irony or a sort of tragedy that it's the most vulnerable in our society. This is true in New Jersey, but it's also particularly true globally, that are the most vulnerable to the devastating impacts of climate change. So there's definitely an equity. It's unevenly distributed across the globe, and within the globe, who lives in the low-lying, often flooded areas? It's typically people with lower income and fewer options.
And I'd like to point out two things. We're lucky in New Jersey because we aren't affected as much. The areas where you'll see the earliest impact is in the fringe areas, whether it's the Arctic or near deserts or the like. But we will be seeing more impacts. The change in mosquito-borne diseases, the changes in tick behavior, the lack of the death of ticks in the wintertime will start to affect us more and more. I would point to the acidification of the oceans as the most important and scariest part of this, because I'm a geologist, and so I look back in geologic history, what the growth of reefs, the growth of was a significant buffering for carbon in the atmosphere. And at this point, unfortunately, the acidification of the oceans is such that reefs and other mechanisms for capturing the carbon are having difficulty because they're right on the cusp of being able to produce the calcium carbonate that they need to grow the reef, and at the same time sequester the carbon dioxide.
I'd like to get back to that later on if we can, but I want to continue on our target here. So we can define it. We just have. We know the what, but can we explain it? The why? Who is responsible for this cause of climate change or global warming, or however you'd like to address it?
Well, I'll take the easy questions then. That's certainly a challenging question, and thank you for laughing at my bad joke. One of the issues is that the problem that we have created is something that lies in the responsibility of all of us and those who have gone before us. And I think one of the challenges here when we start to talk about petroleum, oil, and gas, because these are some of the primary greenhouse gas emitters that we talk about, that are trapping additional heat in our atmosphere and causing an acceleration of global warming, is that those products, that gas, that heat, or that gas, that petroleum, are responsible for allowing us to heat our homes in the winter, to cook our food, to sit under these very warm lamps right now. And so they have given an enormous amount to our society and have allowed us as human beings to proliferate in a way that would not have been possible without them. And so I think there's a time to recognize that and to see that we are in this place because of them, and then say there has to be a better way. We have to be able to develop using our technology and using more efficient means to cook our food, heat our homes. And somebody said to me about 2 weeks ago, and I thought it was worth repeating, we didn't leave the Stone Age as humans. We didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We found a better way. And so it is our responsibility to recognize that we and our forefathers and foremothers caused this issue, and we can find a better way now. We're smart enough to get ourselves out of this.
I would just define that a little bit more, break that down. I mean, I always say, no, I'm sorry, humans do not cause climate change. The Earth's climate has been changing since the Earth was formed. There was an ice age, and we weren't around to mess that one up. But our behavior is so exacerbating a natural phenomena that nature can no longer handle it in the way that she used to. And interesting enough, there was, and you probably know more about this than I do, there was a a NASA-funded study, it must have been about 15 years ago, that said you would have had to double the amount of carbon emitted to the atmosphere in the previous 300 years, which included the Industrial Revolution, to have the same impact on climate change as you had from land use changes, from deforestation, from farming, from building. And that's where it really gets down to the local planning part that I know you want to get to at some point, where it really makes a difference. But I would also add to what David said before, the irony to me with all this pushback we get on it, it was Ronald Reagan who first made climate change a regular part of the National Security Council agenda. Not that he was a big believer that the humans cause it. He wasn't all that sure, but he could see there was a problem. And it is a national security issue, and even General Mattis has said it as recently as a year ago. This is what the changes we are seeing from the climate pose threats to us, because just as you were mentioning of the migration of people, a lot of it is sub-Sahara. When you have your nomadic tribesmen who can no longer graze their herds in the way they did, they move into the cities. There's no place for them there. There are no jobs for them there. And those are prime recruiting grounds for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so there are a whole lot, plus the fact that a lot of these countries are not the most stable country, and you're destabilizing around the world because of these extra pressures.
You just touched on something that I want to address. You recently said that the U.S. is the only industrial nation in the world that doesn't have the environment as one of their cabinet positions. Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit more about that? Because that had a tremendous impact when I heard you say that.
Well, it's true. We are the only industrialized nation in the world that does not consider the environment to be cabinet level. You are treated as cabinet, but you're only an agency. You're not a department. I think that's part of Scott Pruitt's problem, is he wants to be in the line of succession, and he's not. And he's not even a secretary. He's only an administrator. And nobody really wants to bump off an administrator. But anyway, it's just not worth it. But it is, we have, from the very beginning, when Richard Nixon was the one who established the Environmental Protection Agency, working with the Democrat Congress, you had at that point Republicans who didn't want any regulations and Democrats who thought there couldn't be enough regulation. And so the compromise was they were going to do, because the people were the ones who were pushing them to do this. Oh, by the way, it wasn't because Congress suddenly decided they had nothing better to do at a time when we were having race riots in our cities and anti-Vietnam riots on our college campuses. And Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring. The Cuyahoga River burst into flames spontaneously. Our forests were dying, and people were being told they couldn't go outside in the summer because the air quality was so bad. That's what made it happen. But the compromise to get it done was that you wouldn't make it a permanent, full-time, full-fledged cabinet department. And since then, anytime you try to get a piece of legislation, we've tried several times, just get a clean bill through Congress that just says it's cabinet level. Just to say that, can't do it. The minute you try, everybody wants their little piece of the action, and they want this little change here or that change there, and it's almost impossible to have even a discussion about it.
I'd just like to try to meld your two questions together. So the first question was about what's the cause of climate change, and the second one was about EPA's role. And it actually, in the governor describing the EPA's role, part of her description of how it started is about things that people could actually see around them. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes talking about the climate much harder, right? Because if you can see a river on fire, if you can see a Superfund site, if you can see a smokestack bellowing dark pollutants, you can say, okay, there's something that needs to be done. And when you can see the change, when it's cleaner, you can say, oh, we've accomplished something. Right. This is much harder because A, it's global, and B, as the governor previously said, this is something that has happened historically, over the millennia. Climate changes. Some days are beautiful, gorgeous days, and you go, oh, it's so nice and warm, and it's February. You go, oh, this is not bad. I'm enjoying it, So he's like, that can't be that bad. But I think this is why the first question, what's the cause of it? I think we get too bogged down into who causes what when. Mm-hmm. The question really is about what is its impact and whether that impact is something that we can live with. Is that something that we want this generation, the next few generations to have to live with? Because chances are humans can probably adapt to whatever the conditions are, but we're going to lose a whole bunch of species along the way. Mm-hmm. Is that a trade-off that we're willing to accept?
So where does education come from?
Oh, I'd like to interject one thing about the issue of cause. And I would point you to Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth. He talks talked about the lack of positive myths in our society at this point. And I think that we need to start to think about refocusing the way we think about the earth and the way that we respond to the earth in a new set of myths in order to counter this. This is a fundamental change that is getting beyond individuals, beyond even countries, and we need something that can transcend those issues. And myth has done it for us in the past, and I'd suggest that we need some different way of tackling this, because some of what we're fighting against is issues that are as fundamental as the way people look at the world. And without changing that way of looking at the world, we're going to get further and further encamped in different bodies. You're not going to be able to get things through Congress to make it more of a priority. You're going to find that it flip-flops back and forth depending on who you vote for as president. And it needs to be something that transcends all that and brings us back to really focusing on what matters, how our kids, how our grandkids, how they will see the earth. And so I'd go back to some of Joseph Campbell's writings and see what you can think when you've looked at those.
Where does that start, though? And this is for everyone. We're talking about education.
Right.
And is it education on the standard education level? Is it education from a community organization like Green Summit? Is it a panel like this? We have to educate a lot of people about a lot of issues and change policies or ideas before we can actually see an effect. So we're talking about a long-range process. So changing myths takes centuries. Are we talking about centuries?
Can't afford to do that.
So I would build on some of what was said earlier and just add that I believe it is important to know the sources of climate change. If we don't know the sources, we don't have to point fingers and say it was you. But we need to, right, we do need to know what the sources are so that we can make every attempt that we can to combat the accelerated global warming. Yes, Governor Whitman is right. We have life on Earth because the Earth is warmer than the outer atmosphere. But that accelerated warming is a double whammy for us. And I would say that it is the addition of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere as well as the degradation of our forests that could have helped us cope with, and also the dying of our oceans that could help us cope with these problems. In terms of education, I think there are, I'm a bit of an optimist, so I have a high degree of confidence in the education of our general public and even our elected officials. And I think the problem is not necessarily education, I think it's money. And I think it is campaign finance reform. And so that's a topic that's off of today, but I think that if we're talking about making big policy changes in the world, we have to talk about where money it comes from and the role of money in our government. And so I think the education is there. I think the education level is in our students. I think it's in our general society. And you know, we need to keep going with it. We need to keep doing research. We need to keep moving forward. But the conversation is broader than that.
I'll take it this way. I think first of all, I think there's always an opportunity for more education. I don't think there's ever any time that people can't learn more about what an issue is. But I will say that I do think that I have two sons. One is 13, the other is 10. I think they pretty much know there's issues dealing with global climate change.
That's because their dad
No,
is...
no. I just think that there is I think kids who are growing up in this generation, you know, they have a lot of access to technology, and that gives them an ability to know what these issues are. I think part of the issue is that people kind of feel helpless. Like, what am I supposed to do, and what difference would it make if I did it? So I think part of this discussion, I assume, we will go into further as to what either a community or individuals or whatever can do to improve the condition. Because I do think it, now, it's like, I think people have gotten used to the idea that we should stop depending on somebody else to do it. We should just do it ourselves. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other element is the technology piece. And I think this is towards Doug's point of positive myth in some ways, in the sense of part of the reason, again, that you had success with the other environmental issues is people saw concrete results and they felt good about it, right? I mean, in a way, you see the Endangered Species Act and you feel good about it because you see a species recover. If you can't see how technology can make a difference, how we can actually change and make a difference, people will throw up their hands. And that's up to leaders and discussions and people to be involved in trying to figure out how technology can work to improve the environment.
I would just add that if you want something to do and people to support you, there is a climate caucus within the Congress, and there is also the the Problem Solvers Caucus within the Congress. And both of those groups, those members need support because they are taking positions that are often contrary to what leadership wants, because we've gotten into this position where everything is looked at through the partisan political prism rather than the policy prism. It's, what's going to get me another vote in my caucus, what's going to get me another percentage on my reelect. But those people who are willing to stand up for too long have not had, no one's had their back, and no one's had the money to come in with the money to support them. But it's not just money, because we've seen that again and again where candidates, even the best funded candidates, don't win if they don't have the right message, if they have people standing up saying, yes, you're doing what we want you to do, which means we've got to vote, and we haven't been doing that. And that's led us to a place where we have people who represent the most extremes in both parties, in each of the parties, and then you get to a general election and people say, I don't like anybody, and the message it sends is, you're doing a fine job or we don't care. So there are people who are willing to stand up now, and those two caucuses are ones that those members deserve support, and they're the ones who are going to be most under attack in this election cycle.
And they're bipartisan, too.
Oh, no, they're both are bipartisan. I mean, the Problem Solvers is 24 Republicans, 24 Democrats who have agreed that when 75% of them take a position on an issue and they're going after all the big ones, they will vote as a block. And when you start to vote as a block, you are starting to make a difference when it's a tight.
I want to move ahead into water right now because it's a very important topic for New Jersey especially. We all depend upon and consume water. We create waste. But we seldom think about the underlying pipes, sewers, and utilities that sustain the water. But current systems in New Jersey are inadequate. There are three categories of water pipes. There are drinking water pipes, storm water for runoff, drainage, and then wastewater, sanitary pipes to waste treatment plants. There's something called the combined sewer overflow, which I learned about, which is fascinating. It's defined as a discharge event in which both stormwater and untreated sewage combine and flow into the waterways. This is a polluting event. In general, this happens in our country between 23,000 to 75,000 times annually. The estimated amount of drinking water lost each day due to leakage, contamination, and aging in New Jersey is 130 million gallons. So first to Jennifer. In a 2017 op-ed piece for New Jersey Spotlight, you wrote that New Jersey has entered its third consecutive year of drought. How does climate change affect each of the three components of water supply, like water source, water collection, treatment, and distribution, and water demand? And part B, I want you to talk about...
It's like a SAT question.
No easy question. I want you to talk about the water supply plan.
Okay. Let me try to get all of that. So we're here for another 3 hours, right? Yeah. Okay. Starting with climate change. It's really difficult, and you've seen a number of commentators who are more or less smart and articulate than I am get themselves tripped up on the Sunday morning talk shows talking about, was this storm caused by climate change? And they want the exact answer and the data behind it. The issue is, it's complicated. And New Jersey has two compounding forces that we've already begun to talk about today. that impact our water supply, our flooding, and our pollution events. And those are, one, climate change. We are seeing increasing sea level rises. New Jersey often has too much water, which we see through flooding, except for when we don't have enough of it, which we often see through drought. And we did actually have 4 consecutive years, 14, 15, 16, and 17, at least portions of those calendar years, where we were in either a watch or a warning of a drought status. And the other compounding force, so we've got climate change and sea level rise, which can give us too much water, it can give us flashy conditions, or it can give us extended periods of drought. And then we also have land use, and we started to talk about that. So we have a lot of what we wonky policy people call impervious cover. So think about roofs and blacktop and pavement where the water runs off of it very quickly. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the nation. And so with that, we've brought a lot of impervious cover. So those 2 compounding factors of climate change, along with it comes sea level rise and extended periods of drought, along with land use changes that have given us so much impervious cover, are what are really affecting our water cycle and our pollution events. So let's talk about when we have too much water. So when we have flooding events, they're happening fast and furious oftentimes. So I'm going to do the raise your hand thing. Anybody ever have flooding in their basement? Okay, keep your hands up. Anybody's parents ever have flooding in their basement? Yeah, so anybody ever been stuck on a road because of flooding? So New Jerseyans are impacted by flooding. How many people knew that we had 4 consecutive years of drought? Okay, yeah, so a good amount, and I would expect that in this crowd because we've got a pretty educated constituency here today. But there were a lot less people that I encountered that knew about the drought situation. And that brings me to the water supply plan. I'm trying to get part A and B in here together without being here till 3 o'clock in the morning. So the water supply plan in New Jersey is something that the New Jersey legislature had the foresight to say, we should plan for how much water we need and how we're going to get it and how we're going to use it. Right? That's a great idea. The water supply plan was out of date for quite some time. And we did receive a new plan from the DEP just last year, and it was adopted in either November or December by the department. And this plan takes an inventory of how much water we have in different areas of the state, which those of us in water science call watersheds. And it shows that there are some scary things happening in New Jersey, and that by 2020, approximately half of the watershed areas in the state of New Jersey will either be in or near a deficit state. So that doesn't necessarily mean that your tap's going to run dry, but what it means is we're taking more water out of the system than we're putting back in. So has anybody ever, and I won't ask you to raise your hands, taken more money out of their checkbook than they put in it? I was a poor college student. It may have happened once or twice. And so you can imagine what will happen eventually down the line. And what we're seeing right now through water supply and our water supply plan and through monitoring is we're seeing wetlands. We're seeing portions of streams that are starting to dry up. This is particularly happening in South Jersey and our New Jersey pinelands, which are near and dear to my heart. And I say that's the environmental alarm bells going off. You know, that's the alert you now get on your Bank of America app that says, hey, wait, your account balance is low. You might want to think about what you're doing with that card. And so we need to pay attention to that. In my opinion, sitting on the Water Supply Advisory Council, just as myself and a representative of ANJAC, the policies in the water supply plan that were included in the 2017 version were carried over from previous versions of the plan, which were perfectly good ideas at the time, except that the majority of them were not able to be implemented for one reason or another. And there aren't, I will say, many, I'm not going to say any, but there aren't many new policies to address the existing conditions that we know of today in that plan. So what I have been calling for pretty publicly is for a continued addition to that water supply plan so that we can come up with the policies at the state level, at the county level, at the municipal level, and yes, even in your home. What can you do? You could start by stop watering the lawn when there's a drought. I would love, and I know there are some lawn lovers out here, and I've got some of them in my family, to help move New Jersey away from its lawn addiction. You use 4 times the amount of water when you have a lawn, depending on how large it is, than if you live in an urban area. And so that water use is a particular concern. And people aren't necessarily making the connections between what comes out of their tap and what they're using to water their lawn versus what they're flushing in their toilet. But our moderator here was able to do that when he talked about CSOs and wastewater and drinking water. It's all part of the water cycle, right? We learned it in 2nd grade, so they're all connected, and we just need to think about that and be more conscious about it and ask our legislators, hey, how are we doing on our water policy? Are we as bad as California? No, we're not, and we get more water than California. But we still have to pay attention to it, because remember those environmental alarm bells that are going off in the streams and the wetlands down in South Jersey. Did I get all those questions in?
You did indeed.
Okay, good. I got home now?
So then the infrastructure dealing with all of this. Well, this is for everybody now. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure, because this is an aging, antiquated infrastructure. And oftentimes you hear, we can't get the money to replace. So what is the solution? A solution.
So from now putting on my City of Summit hat, right? So everyone who's a resident of City of Summit pays a sewer tax, right? And so that goes towards paying for the infrastructure, trying to deal with it. So, but let's just think about this for a moment. You know, sewers and talking about infrastructure are not the most flashy, sexy things to think about, and how you decide to spend money. Because I'm pretty sure if we had a discussion here about property taxes, we would have a pretty much a sense of where the room would be about spending, raising more and more property taxes to pay for things, right? So this is the balancing that local government, state government all have to do to try to figure out, especially in New Jersey. Property taxes are high. People don't want to pay for it. And then the question is, what do we do? So, for instance, what we did here in the City of Summit in the last 4 months, we decided to go ahead and look at all of our development regulations and ordinances. We hadn't done it for about 15 years. So why did we decide to do that? Because we needed to modernize. We needed to look at these regulations to try to figure out how they work in now that where we are. And among the things that we're going to look at is, how do you try to retain water within the site, rather than having it go on, as Jennifer was talking, through the impervious surfaces, off as runoff, and then you lose it into the streams, and it's gone. And instead, you need it to percolate into the groundwater. We started doing things like rain gardens, which I think Arboretum has a rain garden. Had a rain garden.
We have collection barriers.
Okay, yes. The city has 2 rain gardens that it put in place, and we're going to try to encourage people to do that. We're going to look at impervious surfaces and say, okay, if you put something that's more porous in nature, maybe we give you a little bit of ability to build a little bit more, but you get to do more porous, do porous pavements. Those kinds of issues are the ones that we, again, I go back to, well, you want to have things that people can actually see there's ways they can make a difference. That if you decide when you're hiring a contractor, if I can do A, B, C, D, that will actually either save me money and improve the environment, or I believe so strongly in the environment that it will actually improve the environment, people will take those steps. So those are that if you want to, the next step is, okay, this is the problem, these are the types of solutions.
We talk about financing and money. A great example is the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia was looking at how to deal with CSOs. They looked at the traditional methods, and it was going to cost X, I forget the exact amount, but a huge amount of money. They then looked at how to do it through green infrastructure, rain gardens, pervious pavement, other ways of managing some of the stormwater issues. And they found out that they could actually save money by going green. They had a very positive outcome from the study, and so they are now in the process of managing stormwater in a whole different way. The city of Chicago went to gigantic tanks underground. The Hoboken is looking at the same thing. But the city of Philadelphia actually found that it was cheaper to do it in a way that was also environmentally beneficial.
First, a plug for...
One of the things too,
Okay.
in Scottsdale, they have congestion pricing basically on water usage. And so if you are using, you don't want to use your dishwasher or your washing machine between 9 in the morning and 7 at night. The difference is pennies to dollar.
They do that in Europe, too.
And it works. I mean, we're very obviously cost sensitive, as we should be, and people respond to that. And so therefore you reduce the pressure on your water usage and on your infrastructure by changing people's behavior.
I was just going to put in a plug for Reeves-Reed Arboretum. We are looking into this wonderful porous paving that will help mitigate water flow on the property, which hopefully will be part of phase 2 of our accessibility project. The other thing I wanted to say is, do any of you know much about the smart technology that's being used in sewer systems now? Cincinnati is one of the cities, and it's really been a remarkable change for them, where they were going to invest in changing their, in replacing their infrastructure. Instead, they have a much cheaper way of doing it by putting cameras that monitor. Do you know about this, Jen?
Yeah, so many New Jersey companies and utilities use cameras right now for inspection to find leaks. The issue with the CSOs in New Jersey, and it's not just a New Jersey problem, it's an old industrial state problem. Boston, Philadelphia, DC, many of our cities have the CSO issue, combined sewer overflow, is that they simply weren't, these pipe systems and the wastewater treatment plants were not designed to handle as much flow as we're sending to them right now. And so yes, using cameras is a very smart way and an efficient way of finding where there are leaks and repairing the system. But implementing green infrastructure and implementing porous pavement to try to keep clean water, that rainwater, out of the system is one of the most cost-effective means of solving the CSO problem. EPA did an estimate, EPA Region 2, of New Jersey's CSO issues. And if we were to fix it in a traditional way, I believe the number was $22 billion. So we could start passing the hat and see how far we get tonight. But I don't think we'd get nearly as far enough to start. And so using the green infrastructure, changing our development codes so that we transition over time. It's not a one fix. We're not going to fix it within one political term or one calendar year. It's a transition over time to get ourselves out of this problem.
Does anybody want to talk about the clean water rule?
I don't. I'm not really sure
I mean,
what specifically.
the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Drinking Act. There's a difference between Clean Water Act and the Clean Drinking Water Act. Those are two different standards.
In my research, I found the Clean Water Rule, the regulation define the scope of federal water protection in a more consistent manner, particularly over streams and wetlands. The rule was published.
Waters.
You're talking about, the waters of the United States.
Yes.
That's highly controversial, and one of the reasons why it is because there is no generalized one standard. And we have 10 regions in the Environmental Protection Agency, and they tend to act fairly independently. And they will define often, because we ran into this problem when I was at EPA, a dry hole that a rancher has that fills up when it rains heavily and then will drain into a stream, which could be considered a water of the United States. And so they come in with their regulatory hats on and say, okay, you've got to put fencing around this, you've got to handle this all differently. And they're looking at them and say, look, it fills up once a year, maybe twice a year. And so the extremes are what have driven this to being a very controversial issue. But the whole point is, if you have a water body and you are, running your cattle into it, and so they do what cattle do in the water, and it ends up in a water of the United States in a stream, that's a problem. If you're over-fertilizing, putting too much pesticide on. And so that's where that particular regulation comes into play. And one of the things that we did, and Jennifer, you mentioned it, which is watersheds at the agency, and it gets back to trying to get people to understand what they can do. there's as much, I mean, just one statistic, there's as much oil deposited along the coastline United States every 8 months from non-point source pollution as was released during the Exxon Valdez spill, which was up until the Deepwater Horizon, our biggest thing. And that's from people changing the oil in their car in their driveway and dumping it in. And so you had to get people to understand they lived in a watershed. And they don't get it. Most people don't have a clue that they live in a watershed. And so in order to educate them, what we did is we went to the Meteorological Association, because people pay the most attention watching the news when they're watching the weather, because that has a real impact on them, as you've all mentioned. That's what people care about, what affects me. And we said to them, the meteorologists, we did 2 pilot programs saying, when you are going to forecast a big weather event and a big storm, say to people, and oh, by the way, this may not be a good time for you to fertilize your lawn or to put down pesticide because it's going to wash away. And you live in a watershed, and it's going to get in. You may not be near a stream, but it's going to go into this storm drain, and that's going to end up in a stream, and that's going to end up in the ocean. And for, you know, down the Mississippi River, you see all those dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico because of runoff from the farmers. Most of it upriver on the Mississippi. And the other thing we did was a nutrient trading program, which was to allow if a utility was having a problem because of what was coming downstream that they were then having to clean up because the ranchers or the farmers upstream were over fertilizing or running their cattle too close to the streams. You're not allowed to run them in anymore. And it was going to cost them, let's say, $20,000 to fix the problem, and it was going to raise rates by 5 or 10. And they could pay the rancher $2,500 to handle their manure a different way or to fence their cattle away, put different water there, and that would reduce what they had to do downstream. Then let's do that. It was much cheaper for them to do that. So those are the kinds of things that you can look at and do and try to think slightly differently about how you address the problem.
You said something, well, what affects me? So a question that was given to me by one of the panelists. So shouldn't my kids just drink bottled water? Isn't that a solution?
EPA does not regulate bottled water. You don't know what's in it. And oh, by the way, you don't know how it was stored. And when you have a plastic and it's been stored at high temperature or in the sun, which it could have been on a flatbed, that releases the chemicals in the plastic. And if anyone doesn't believe it, because I had this happen in Arizona, I had a jar of Aveeno, you know, the hand cream, and it was by my sink in my bathroom, but there was a skylight, and it had moved out a little bit, and I guess for a day or two it was where the sun hit it. And when I went to use it, it smelled just like petroleum. Yes. I mean, it was. And this is what happens. And so people know bottled water is not the answer that everyone thinks it is.
And if you think about what happened, well, let's take the water out of the bottle, right? Then you still have a bottle.
Exactly.
And then you have to get rid of that bottle. And that bottle, some of it maybe get recycled, but a lot of time people just throw it away. It gets into a landfill, or it releases and it goes in sometimes into the ocean. That plastic degrades, becomes little plastics. The fish eat that, and you eat the fish.
And also, there are 2 islands, one in the Atlantic and one in the Pacific, the size of Alaska, from plastic. That's right. That is all coagulated.
Less than 20% of the plastic bottles in the United States end up in the recycling stream. Right. And the secondary market for recycled plastics is pretty small. So there are some products, so the aftermarket value is not as beneficial as we would like to think it is. The World Economic Forum has a report that keeps me up at night. They released this study last year, and what it says is that by 2050, so let's think about 2050, so I have a niece, and she's about to be 9 next week, so by the time my 9-year-old niece is my age, the World Economic Forum says that there will be more plastic in our oceans than fish, pound for pound, if we keep using single-use plastics the way that we're using them. This is a very solvable problem, and so starting with our water is a really easy solution to start to reduce our plastic use.
You know what? Years ago when I was a kid, you had deposits, and that's how we kids made money.
Yep.
And you would go around, someone would throw out a milk bottle, and you take it down, and you got 2 cents a bottle. Maybe we've got to look at something like that.
Let's go on. This is directed to everyone. How has industry directly affected climate change, and in particular, water resources?
I'm closest to you, so you keep looking at me.
Being one of the industry people on the panel.
Yes, because
maybe
I have
the only industry
part
person on the panel.
A, the next
Yeah.
part is directed to you too.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Oh, good, another two-part question.
It's really important to understand that the people, that pressure from people in society changes industry's behavior. And it is critical to let them know what is important. When jobs are more important than the environment, then jobs become more important than the environment. It's critical that we understand what is wanted, what is needed. I'm lucky enough to work for the biggest chemical company in the world, and at the same time, one who has taken sustainability on and embraced it early and tries very hard. A lot of the things that we make go towards improving the environment, including the material that makes it pervious pavement, by the way. But in doing so, it also...
You can get them a deal.
Why do you think he's here?
Thank you for your help. Yeah. But in making things and in the way that things are made, there are impacts to the environment where we work diligently to try to reduce those. But it happens, and it's part of the whole cycle.
But here's an interesting... When you said cycle, though, that's what triggered this, because it's the education, going back to education. Now, BASF Corporation was not always this way.
No.
Because, and I'm not just pointing this up, in 2003, there was this Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board complaint about the runoff hazard at the mobile chemical plant that was in violation of the California EPA Water Code. Now, I know, you work in remediation, and that's a very important part. It's probably more expensive to remediate than it is to prevent.
Yeah, sure. And we recognize that. I mean, I would say we are remarkably better at not releasing things than we used to be. We have a facility that uses platinum and gold that we closed down a few years back, and I did the remediation on that. That was a remarkably clean site. And it's, if we were to look at other chemicals the same way, and we do try to improve on this, you will find that those are impacts those impacts will reduce. I'll give you one positive note. As we use more the horrible plastics in our cars, we have been able to increase the size of the car, and so everybody who drives an SUV should be happy. We have been able to increase the size of the cars, and they've increased dramatically, while reducing the emissions from them, partly because the weight to engine ratio has changed, the way things are controlled are better. All of those come from industries that are working on that. If we would then reduce the size of the car, it would make it even better. But it's again, and I admit to being a rabid tree hugger. Okay, so I am as strong an environmental advocate as there is. But we do make trade-offs. I was talking to somebody about fracking and the pluses and minuses of fracking. Fracking gives us the opportunity to change to use natural gas instead of coal. It changes a lot of behaviors in a positive way. Now we have to figure out how to do it in a way that is protective of the groundwater, protective of the environment around the wells. Those things have to be figured out and controlled.
Or alternatives to fracking, like air and...
I'm not, I'm just saying that it's a step in the right direction. One of the reasons we've been able to approach the greenhouse gas emission reductions that we've been looking for is in large part the change to natural gas. So there are, we have to, as a society, think about the real sustainable development, real sustainable issues where it's the environment, social, and economic conditions. All of those are supposed to be in balance to be truly sustainable. And each piece of what we decide where we put pressure on one, it has impacts on the other. As a parent and as hopefully grandparents shortly, I look forward to continuing to push to make the environment better, and I think that's what we need to do, especially with things like global warming, where it's not just a site with some contamination in the soil. We need to think about how to do that, but at the same time, there aren't a lot of people here who want to give up a lot of things. So we need to work with industry to explain what they want, what we want paints that don't have the VOCs in them that we used to have. We want cars that are more efficient, and we need, and that's critical. We need better batteries. We need all the things that will move us forward. But when you make those choices, you also make choices on the other parts of the sustainable package.
Well, sometimes the industry leads the way. I found a note about how Exxon in 2015, the company scientists had considered the effect of carbon dioxide emission on the climate, and concluded that humanity would have to wean itself off of fossil fuels. This was in-house. This was a study done in-house at Exxon and promoted by the scientists. So it comes also from industry as well.
And there, hopefully, we'll, as we didn't run out of rocks, which as a geologist I'm happy for. But we also, so there's, hopefully we'll have technologies that are beneficial, can replace fossil fuels, can replace give us the same quality of life with less impact on the environment. And we're, pressure from everybody to make that important is how it changes.
Okay, I want to move on because we are getting close. So this is for all the panelists. What are the top 3 things a community like Summit can do to address climate change? And take it, why don't we start with you, Melanie, since societal is really an interesting point of view.
Yeah, well, I'll take the opportunity to connect it to the Sustainable Jersey program, and I want to give a shout out to the Summit Green team. Summit is one of our star communities. So Sustainable Jersey is a municipal and school, I'd love to talk about education too, sustainability certification program. And the way it got started was by establishing best practices, which we call actions, and you get points for doing actions, and those accrue towards your status. And as I said, Summit is a silver certified. We don't have any gold certified communities. That's because we have reserved the notion of a gold standard in sustainability for outcomes, for performance measures. At least that's our ideal. So not the checklist of actions you do, as good as that may be, but hopefully things you can measure. So we have a gold standard in energy that's all about greenhouse gas emissions, which is a metric that we can measure pretty easily. Water is much more complicated, and in particular, what is the municipal role? You can't hold a municipal government, that's who we certify, accountable for the behavior of industry upstream of so many different things. So we're trying to focus in on what Summit can do. And Summit's a great example. So you spoke about green infrastructure and about changing zoning and land use planning. So part of our, and it's a work in progress, our new gold standard in water that we're working on is 2 green infrastructure actions. So there's a planning one and there's the implementation one, and they are moving into this performance measure. So we challenge municipalities to first do an assessment, do things that they haven't done before and build new capacities. It's not going to be easy. Do an assessment using a geographic information system. GIS is a great way to do that. How much impervious cover do we have right now? What is our projected growth, and what is our plan for addressing it? And then the municipalities further challenged to set numeric targets. So what percentage of green infrastructure in our short-term 5-year window, and then for more points, a longer time window, and either by reducing impervious surface, by switching to impermeables or pulling stuff out, or by otherwise accommodating the water flow off of the impervious surface. But it can be a combination of green and gray infrastructure. So that will be something that will be measurable and towns can be held to account for. So part and parcel, that isn't just, I shouldn't say just, there's the planning, there's the putting in the actual projects like the bioretention basins, but then there's also looking at land use tools that, I mean, municipalities in New Jersey have a lot of power in certain things, and the zoning and land use regulation and what developers have to do, this is fully within the municipal wheelhouse. So that is an excellent example of where towns can really make a difference and really be held to account.
Anyone else want to jump in with top three?
Well, I'll tell you what we're doing, or we're looking into in the short term. So one is we're doing an assessment of our municipal public lots to see which ones can sustain having solar paneling. So we have solar, so you generate electricity that way and reduce our carbon footprint. We're going to come out with a sidewalk master plan because of connectivity and reducing the need for cars. And then the third thing, which I've been intimately involved in through a nonprofit that I helped found, is the construction of a free market building, a permanent free market building, which will be the first one, I believe, in New Jersey, where we've had for the last 10 years plus, Summit has had this program where people bring in stuff that they don't want anymore in their homes, and there are other people within the community who come and take it. And it's been hugely successful. It's an incredible thing to see because it's the community helping, but what it does is it reduces the amount of waste that goes into the waste stream. It helps the city as far as tipping fees, and it helps the community. And so we're in the process of building a permanent free market building, and hopefully that'll be done by the end of the year.
That also builds community in the oldest fashioned way as possible, which is the marketplace, where people used to gather in the center of town and do exactly that.
Yeah.
So you asked a challenging question because it's
Thank
could
you.
be controversial. I would say for any town, so Summit and the other 564 municipalities that we have in New Jersey, there are a number of actions that municipalities can take. One, I would say help your citizens get off of the fossil fuels. There's a great initiative led by a nonprofit coalition called Charge EVC. And the idea there is to help grow the electric charging station for electric vehicles. There's something called range anxiety when you have an electric vehicle. How far can I go before I need to charge again? And so we need more anxiety in New Jersey. We've got tax anxiety, traffic anxiety, flood. So the idea here is to help build these quick charge stations so that you can get a fast charge off of a short period of time, and looking at your land use codes and developing these quick charge stations at movie theaters, at malls, at places of business, so that individuals who own these vehicles have a place to go to recharge them. All municipalities, we call for protecting your stream buffers. So those forested or grassy areas along our waterways, that's where we see flooding first. So when the river or the stream jumps the bank, it's first in that vegetated area. So the more that you protect those areas, the more it can absorb the water before it ends up in your basement or on your porch or in the bottom of your car. And so, yes, it's controversial to talk about stopping development, but in those most precious and most important areas, that's critical. And we also talk about, as Melanie said earlier, green infrastructure. So what the heck is that? We have sponsored in a number of municipalities working with Rutgers University a rain garden rebate program for residents. This helps them remember the water cycle that we all learned in 2nd grade. And so you can then go to a design workshop, learn how to build a rain garden, install this beautiful pollinator garden that has multiple benefits to it, helps recharge water, helps manage flooding, helps the bees that we know are suffering, and gets New Jersey off of its lawn habit so that we have to water it less. So those are 3 things that we're recommending in all municipalities.
Okay, I'd like to continue. There's a quote by the late theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and author Stephen Hawking. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. Why do people deny the science of climate change?
Because science isn't exact. and you can find scientists who are credible people, who have long pedigrees, who will say that it's not us, it's not real, it's a natural phenomenon, we don't need to worry too much. I was at an event last night where someone said they just received a 50-page document signed off on by a host of seemingly reputable scientists, and just denying that this was an issue about which we need to be concerned. I think part of the problem we have too, Al Gore he was both good and bad. He did a very good thing with An Inconvenient Truth in bringing people's attention to climate change. He undid it with his hockey stick graph that said implied the world is going to end tomorrow. He said he made it much too immediate so that when things didn't go south as fast as he implied, the naysayers had a wide open field. And since science, it gets back to what we were talking about before, the individual, it's so overwhelming, it's climate, what can I do? I can't affect this, it's much bigger than me, and I got to worry about whether I can make my mortgage or whether my kids are going to go to school and this kind of thing. I can't worry about that, that's way out there. And when you have scientists who will say, no, we don't think this is an issue, even though it's 97-4, it's still, there's enough there that those who want to promote the denial, because they have seen, they've put a lie to something we know, which is it is not a zero-sum game between economic growth and environmental protection. Between 1985 and 2012, the population in this country grew by over 20%. Our energy demand went up over 35%. Our real GDP in real dollars, today's dollars, almost doubled, and yet we reduced the 6 criteria pollutants by over 67%. So there were more people demanding more, using more energy, growing our economy while we were still significantly reducing air pollutants. So it's not a zero-sum game, and we've got to break that mindset.
I was particularly touched and moved by something you said recently on CNN about science. There's a rulemaking process. Once you say science isn't important, once you say truth isn't important, you open the door to fascism, the making up of truth with no studies or evidence to back it up. Pretty powerful.
Well, I believe it.
Anyone else want to comment on this before we move on?
Yeah, I think that was I won't say it's bigger than science. It's bigger than climate change. And I did want to say that because I feel like when we talked about education earlier, it's understanding both in an empirical and scientific way, but also in a moral way, that actions have consequences. And that's the thing that we're losing. And that we can know things about the world imperfectly, but asymptotically getting closer through the scientific method. If we lose that in climate change or science, we're going to lose it in politics too. Can we do the claims our politicians make pass the sniff test? I could give some examples, but I won't get too political.
Not today.
Right, but we need to know what is verifiable, either, and this is bigger than climate change. And the other just little thing, it's become a matter of identity and not of.
And science is messy because it doesn't have, you don't get to an answer, you get closer to answers. And that process is important to some of us, but it's scary to others. And so that's part of the problem.
Before we move on to questions from the audience, I want each of you, starting with Jennifer and going down.
Poor Jennifer.
I want your.
I will remember this.
I want your 1-minute elevator speech. 1 minute max.
On anything?
No. I read your Twitter post. Don't forget.
1 minute. I would say I love New Jersey. I chose to move to New Jersey. I grew up in Philly. I also love my hometown. But New Jersey has very special places. We have cities, we have shore, we have places in the Pines and the Highlands where you can have absolute peace, and then you can have robust areas to experience culture and, quite frankly, some of the best food in the world. We have some real challenges as well. There are 9 million of us. We have an incredibly diverse state. When the census considers Latino, 55, the census shows us that we're about 55% white, so we have cultural divides as well. I think the environment and the challenges that we have facing us on climate change, having enough water to drink, experiencing flooding in our roads, is a real opportunity for us to unite together and work for a common cause. I think that the challenges of having too much water, except for when we don't have enough of it, are a real clarion call for us to work from local government with ECs as we do, working with green teams and elected officials, and
The
I'm
elevator
excited to be
has
part
reached
of it.
its floor.
Excellent, there we go.
David.
You gotta give me a clock.
Hopefully I'll take less than a minute. So I'll bring it from New Jersey down to Summit. So Summit, for those of you who aren't from Summit, is a city that's basically run by volunteers. We're a city of 22,000 people. We have a city staff of about, let's say, 200 total for everything. And the rest is done by volunteers. The council is made up of volunteers, basically, since none of us get paid. And then we have a whole bunch of boards that are run by volunteers. I'm extremely optimistic. We have really smart people in this town who every year are willing to give of their time. I think there's more increased focus on getting things done. And I think we all now recognize, as I said earlier, that we individually and as a locality can make a difference, and it's upon us to do it. And so while, yeah, we have huge problems and all of these types of things that go around, I think at a very local level, we're going to see we see a lot of great ideas, and we're going to try to implement a lot of great ideas, and that'll make a big difference.
Thank you. Governor Whitman.
Well, we've always said that the states are laboratories of democracy, and so are the municipalities, and that's where we are going to see the kind of progress, I believe, at least in the short-term future, that we need to see. And we need people to understand that they have a role to play in this. And in fact, their voice does make a difference. And they can influence, not necessarily every vote, but they can certainly influence the way people look at issues, their elected officials, the way they address them, and sometimes how they decide on them. So we've got to accept that role. We will go to the mat to protect our rights as citizens in a democracy. We sometimes forget that we also have responsibilities, and that means we have to get engaged. We have to vote. We have to let our elected officials know what we expect of them, what we want from them, what our priorities are. Otherwise, they'll make up their own.
Thank you. Doug.
I would bring it even closer to home and say that each of us are, I'm guessing, that all of us are very lucky who are in this room, that we have the ability to make choices. We don't always think about our choices, how we teach our kids, how we purchase things, how we vote, but all of those things matter. And one of the things I'd ask each of us to think about is there are a lot of people who don't have choices, and how can we empower them to make choices that are impactful to them. We are not far from communities that have a lot fewer choices in this state, and they feel the impact of climate change more than we do. They feel the impact of decisions that we make regarding development and other things more than we do. So we should all think about, whenever we're talking to our kids, talking to others, how we spend our money all matter, and both on the political side and on the societal side.
Thank you, Doug.
So I heard I want to echo what the other panelists have said, that two very important ways of making a difference are the power of volunteers, and I want to speak about social movements. So these are people working together, and the power of government. We are not alone. Our choices do matter as individuals. I think it's a moral thing to do, and we can model it for our kids. And no, we don't need bottled water. And yes, we can bike and walk, and I think those things matter. But I think working together, so Sustainable Jersey, my program is just one example, but it's powered by volunteers. And then holding our elected officials to account. We have a democracy, it's precious, and we can and we must, to address climate change, we as much as these local things matter, we have to make national scale choices as well. And we need big investments. And that's what government's there for. So it should make it do its job.
Thank you, Mel. All right, we're going to open this up to questions, a few questions since we've run over a bit. So anyone who has a question for the panel, please.
Okay, great. Governor, I'm going to pick up on a comment you made about congestion pricing. I'm Richard Lawton with the New Jersey Sustainable Business Council, and you mentioned congestion pricing for water. Right. And I just want to pick up on the point in terms of looking at complex systems, a hydrological system, economic system, where are the areas of leverage to drive systemic change. And one area of leverage is price. What we all pay for things as individuals, as companies, has a powerful effect in terms of the calculus of our decisions. So my question is, congestion pricing, putting a price on carbon, that's one area where some conservatives and liberals actually agree that it would be a wise thing to do, because not all prices include their true costs.
Well, they certainly don't for water. And actually, I just signed on with a group that has been working for quite a while now on a formula for pricing carbon, on how you set the price, where you do it, and you make it revenue neutral. I mean, you give it back to people. And that's the way to get the conservative side of the ledger to buy into this. I mean, part of it goes to improving our infrastructure and doing the things that we need to do to keep ourselves moving forward, and the other part goes back to public with lesser taxes in other areas. But you're right, because if people can see their decisions impacting, that they have control over their costs by the decisions they will make decisions that do reduce those, and when you have a carbon tax, that's what you're getting at. So I'm a firm believer in a carbon tax. I'm just now getting my feet wet with the level of detail that they've been working on for the last few years. But we should be coming out with that fairly soon.
Susan, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question and an announcement. Thank you to the panel. Susan Haig, founder of civicstory.org. My question is regarding the news media, which we haven't mentioned. And the news media is our civic information system. And as Governor Whitman says, it's far too oriented toward party so that people are penalized for compromising. And I think that bipartisanship and compromise is the way democracy works. It's the way that works. So I would say, can we be more vocal in maybe even behind the scenes, talking to news editors and saying we need a different kind of information that rewards compromise and that rewards the middle ground. There are all these people in the middle, and we don't get that. So that's my question. My announcement is that there's a wonderful opportunity to get at what many of you have mentioned, and that is that people who have less are being unfairly penalized by the environment. And that is on May 21st in Newark, there's going to be a blessing of the electric vehicles by Newark Black clergy at noon at 404 Avon Avenue. And this is with Green Faith and some of the people who are making electronic charging stations and the Newark clergy. So it's a real opportunity for other environmental organizations to go there and be part of it and to show that this is really an everybody thing now.
The only thing you have to be a little careful of electric vehicles, they're only as clean as the power used to produce the energy that comes out of the thing. So you can't look at that as just this is the answer to everything, because you have to consider the whole. It's the entire pipeline.
Hi, everyone. This is Melissa Spur from Green Summit, New Jersey. I wanted to ask about, there's only so much any individual can do, and, we've already touched on that. And I wanted to know about gray water systems, and being that part of the water issue is, solving drinking water through recycling, what they're calling recycled water, meaning cleaned sewage water. Why aren't gray water systems a bigger part of kind of the home conservation plan and community conservation plan for water?
They used to be. They used to be. Water, not only gray water, but cisterns and collection of rainwater used to be a big part of the water supply for homes. Then we learned we got electricity and we could pump water, and it was easy. So we moved away from the cost of building cisterns, and we moved away from the things that we are talking about now. Go to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and you'll go to some of the old antebellum homes, and they have massive cisterns where they collected water. It's a lot of what we're talking about isn't new, but we moved away from it because of convenience, because it's easier to deal with other ways. The gray water systems are for watering your flowers, for watering the pollinators, plants and the like, is a great way of saving water. I forget the exact number, but it's thousands. Every time you take water out of the ground, it's thousands of years before it returns to the ground. And so, if you can save and repurpose the water, it will go a long way. So it's a great way of saving or reusing it a second time.
Is there a way to kind of legislate that as part of the community, I want to say, mandates on code, I mean, even on a state level, making that a part of how homes are constructed, how commercial buildings and new construction, the expectations that they are saving water?
Right, well, you could always, you can look at the development regulations, and that's part of what we're doing, is looking at changing the DRO, the development regulations and ordinances. We have a golf course, a municipal golf course. A lot of times in golf courses, you can use gray water. That's one that's owned by the city. There's another one that's also in town that happens to be a private club. Those things can actually be used gray water. And in a lot of communities, especially out in the West, it is not because of the limitations of water. I think it's partly because one gets the sense in New Jersey that you don't have that same limitation, whether you're sitting in Arizona or Nevada, and you go, oh, you can see around you a desert. You can see why you need to reuse water. In New Jersey, you walk around and you see green fields, and you go, well, there's plenty of water. What am I worried about here, right? So that's part of the education issue that we were talking about before, and that's part of how you try to change policy.
I have a question here.
Hi, my name is Deborah Muniz, and this is to the point of recycling and reducing. I've been out in Oregon over the past few years, and I noticed they have a number of regulations around businesses only using paper bags, not plastic. And in restaurants, they have only glasses versus plastic cups. What would it take for our town or our state to get those types of regulations to help towards reducing?
Support. Support.
Exactly.
I mean, it would take, you can't ask a municipality to stand up and the municipal commissioners to stand up and say, okay, we're banning plastic. You're going to get a 10-cent, because they do this in a number of states. It's going to charge you 10 cents for if you use a plastic bag, or you get 10 cents back or 5 cents back if you bring your own bag. If the public doesn't say, yes, this is what we want, because if they're going to get hammered by it, they're not going to do it. Because not just because they're afraid of re-election, but they're supposed to represent the people they serve. Exactly. And if the people they serve aren't telling them that this is what they want, then it's a tough question.
If people don't, if people don't come to council meetings and say anything, right? How are we supposed to know that you want it? There's no way.
There are a number of municipalities who have and
Long
are
Branch,
poised to take
Ventnor.
action. So Long Branch, Margate, Ventnor, Jersey City have passed plastic reduction initiatives on bags, outdoor balloon releases. There is legislation on a suite of bills pending in New Jersey. So there are some marker bills, some example bills that are out there. They're being rewritten right now. But the more that the people of New Jersey tell their legislators, tell their council people, we have to do something here. This is a problem. That's going to make it go faster. But we are seeing some momentum start to build in New Jersey, and that's really exciting.
I would say that you're better off, rather than pushing for paper bags, bring your own bag. Right. Reuse
Absolutely.
a bag.
Absolutely.
Because paper bags, the environment, the impact on the environment is significant, and there is some discussion whether it's actually worse for a paper bag or a plastic bag. Right. But if you bring one and reuse it, you don't need either.
One more question, and then we have to wrap this up. Anybody have a question?
Just to follow up on the question, what would it take, David? Would it come into council?
I think we're going to save that one for offline.
I thought Deborah's was the last question.
I know, yes, exactly.
It's just basic civics. Do you want a list of 1,000 signatures?
No.
And then a council?
Well, let's I'll break this down. So among the things that we did this year in council was to have different commissions come in front of us. We had the Environmental Commission come in front of us and talk to us about, as a council, hear what it is as far as issues that they want us to tackle with. talking about a tree ordinance. We didn't talk about trees even though we're sitting in an arboretum. One of the big issues is, of course, preservation of historic trees, but also you look at climate change, the impact on trees, and which tree species can survive. And that has a huge impact, because if you think about the cycle, I'm not trying to avoid the question, I'll get to the question. The cycle of having large trees that die off, then you plant some small trees. Well, the amount that they're taking from the carbon is much lower than the large trees, right? So that's part of the issues of what we're trying to deal with. But to answer your specific question, what will it take? It takes people and a sustained effort to come, because yes, we're talking here among probably like-minded people. But there are other people who will say and come out and say, wait a second, you want me to spend another 10 cents on my groceries for each single bag? I have 20 bags. Every week I'll go through 20 bags, Okay, to some person who's living on the margin, that starts costing a lot of money and making a difference in their livelihood. And their store owners, wait a second, you want me to get rid of all the styrofoam, which is much cheaper for me to purchase than going into paper? You want me to get rid of straws? Well, my customers want straws. You need to develop not an adversarial, but you have to develop a consensus among a community, and you have to go out there, convince folks who are in those business lines who have margins, who they have to meet. A restaurant owner, if you tell them get rid of the styrofoam, you're talking about their margin. And that's whether they stay open or they stay shut. And that has an impact. You don't want a whole bunch of downtown restaurants shut down. That has an impact on overall properties. So these are all, sometimes it sounds very easy, but then you get to the nitty-gritty of how you actually get these things accomplished, and then it becomes the hard stuff. But a sustained effort of a consensus where the community comes together and talks about these issues. Part of it is simply having the discussion, raising the issues, and then having the outreach to people of different points of view.
Yeah.
David, thank you for bringing up about the trees. That's the second hour. Reeves-Reed Arboretum, CL Power, Green Summit, we all look to you. You, all of you, our experts, our neighbors, our family, our friends, for innovation, for common sense solutions to a fair and more kind and sustainable world. To paraphrase Abe Lincoln, we are the last best hope. Thank you all tonight.